you didn't say a whole lot about the film, making the film. And that's how I got to learn Evelyn better because of all the trips we made to schools together, which weren't always easy. We had to deal with snow and storms and all kinds of areas in our trips, but perseverance helped. And so we visited many schools and interacted with many students to make the film. And Evelyn and I met in the School of Public Health when she was a student, and then I think she was also working in the school for a while, and that's how we got to know each other. But making the film really bonded us because we had this project, and it took quite a while. I don't remember how long it took us to complete the film. And it included adventures that were very meaningful, I think, to both of us. So I'm very grateful to her for making this film because I have shown it in many times in schools where I'm invited to speak and still are, and there are requests for it. And I think the strength of the film is it speaks to the students. They can relate to it. They see themselves in it, and teachers enjoy the film as well.
Irene, I want to just interrupt you for a minute because I think I forget about a friend of ours who was really instrumental in helping with the film and getting the students. And she died within the last year. And her name was forgotten right this minute.
Suzanne Hopkins.
Thanks, I'm sorry. Suzanne Hopkins. And she was a teacher in Saline. And she really was instrumental in so many aspects of the film. And I don't want to forget to appreciate her contribution. Excuse me.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because she continued to play a big role in my life, because even after we made the film, and especially after my book was published, I was invited to many different schools in Michigan and Ohio, and I'm not able to drive anymore, so she was my driving companion, and she always referred to it as driving Miss Daisy in her way of taking me to all these different schools, and I really miss her. So I'm glad that you paid this tribute to her, Evelyn. Well, I'll talk a little bit about my story and how I got to write this book and how that is kind of filling my life these days when I'm retired and we're all locked out because of COVID. So I was born in Berlin. I'll make it short. And grew up in a wonderful, loving family. And my grandfather owned a bank. My father was partner in the bank. And of course, when Hitler came to power and the Nazis had their rules, then Jews couldn't own banks anymore and it was taken away. So when my father became unemployed, he decided to go to Holland to try to find employment. And also he thought that maybe we could escape Hitler because Holland remained neutral during World War I. He found a job with the American Express Company in Amsterdam. And after some time, we were able to follow my mother, my brother, and I. And we had two relatively happy years in Amsterdam. Of course, our standard of living was significantly lower than in Berlin, but there were some relatives, and many people left Germany during those next years and sometimes stopped in Amsterdam. So after 2 years, the Nazis invaded and Holland became an Nazi occupied country, and the persecution of Jews escalated. And so, with all the restrictions that were imposed on us, um, we eventually were deported. And we were lucky in the fact that my father applied to a person in Sweden for South American passports. And while the passports didn't arrive before we were deported to Westerbork, a German concentration camp, actually a transit camp in Holland. And after about 4 months, the passports arrived in Westerbork, which was a miracle because we didn't get any mail forwarded from our home address. So the passports changed our status as Jews. We were no longer just Jews. We became exchange Jews, relevant to a German foreign policy where they intended to exchange Jews for German prisoners of war, but also civilians, German civilians who had come to the United States and to South and Central American countries sometime earlier in the 20th century. And that was the policy. So because we now were exchange Jews, we had some value to the Nazis. And we were sent to a concentration camp in Germany, Bergen-Belsen, where a section of Bergen-Belsen was an exchange camp where there were thousands of people who had passports, either to the United States or United States citizenship, or one of the many Central and South American countries. We were told that we wouldn't be there long in Bergen-Belsen because we would be exchanged, but exchange seemed unreachable. The camp was abominable, and Bergen-Belsen is a camp where most people died, not through gas chambers, but it's called a slow death camp, and the survival rate was very low. And then after almost 1 year, my parents' health had declined hugely, and we were barely surviving. There was the announcement of a transport, an exchange transport. We would be exchanged. And we were included in a group of 300 people out of several thousands, and boarded a Red Cross train from Bergen-Belsen to Switzerland. The sad part of the story is that my father died the second night on the train, and his remains were taken off the train in a small German town called Biberach, southern Germany. And my mother and brother and I had no choice but to continue the journey. 2 days later, we arrived in Switzerland. The exchange took place at the German border. And when we arrived at a small town in Switzerland called St. Gallen, my mother and brother were hospitalized immediately because of severe illness. And I was 14 years old and not allowed to stay with them. The Swiss claimed they had too many refugees. And together with many other people from Bergen-Belsen, although there were others who had died on the train, we were sent to a refugee camp in North Africa, in Algiers, called Jeanne d'Arc, in a town called Philippeville. The war had not ended. It was approximately 3 months before the end of the war. So I had no connection with my mother and brother until I found out that they were recovering. And there was hope that either I could go back to Switzerland to be reunited or they would come to the camp. But neither of those possibilities materialized. And the end of one year in the camp in Algiers, I should mention, we had family in America. They provided affidavits. We got visas, and I was able to board a Liberty ship and arrived in Baltimore on Christmas Eve, 1945. Um, it took 6 more months for my mother and brother to be able to come to the United States. So it was an 18 months separation. I stayed with relatives in New York. And only then were we able to start a new life as a family. Well, so I've been in America ever since. I took advantage of many opportunities, first high school, then college, and then university, where I met my husband, have a family. I have 2 children, 3 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren at this point. And in many ways, I've had a very rich life. Now, I did not talk about the, the Holocaust for more than 40 years, nor did my mother, my brother, and I say many words about it in all those years. And it was, well, there were several forces that led me to speak, but one of them was Elie Wiesel, who once said, I listened to him on the radio, I happened to hear a talk he gave where he said that if you were in the camps, if you smelled the air, I mean, if you breathed the air and smelled the, the, the death, then it is your duty to be a witness, to, to provide testimony, and to tell your story. And that had a very profound impact on me. And I've been talking in schools ever since, more than 35 years now. It is one reason that I decided to write my memoir, that the students have been so responsive, so engaged in my stories, identify in many ways, because a lot of young people have faced tragedies in their lives, different tragedies, but they could identify. And so that's what led me to write my memoir, because someday when I can't go to schools anymore, then there is the book. It's used now in many schools by many teachers. And I'm still talking. I talked in a school in Ohio yesterday on Zoom to 600 students. And it's a joy to be able to do that and transmit the lessons that I learned from my experience during the Holocaust. I think that's about all I'm going to say, but very pleased to answer any questions.
Yeah, we have several questions, and thank you so much for sharing your story. And obviously there's so much more to the story, and the book is wonderful. So I highly recommend that you read Shores Beyond Shores. So some of us attended a talk by Michael Berenbaum the other day on Zoom, and he talked about the crisis of polarization. And it made me think of you, Irene, because of your work with Zaytuna and what you were able to accomplish, even though some may, it's a small start, but you can have a big impact. And I just wonder if you could share a little bit about starting that group, why you started it and how you made that work, and what the status of that is today.
Sure. Well, it got started in at the time when the conflict in Israel began to be more and more acute with intifadas. And I have a daughter who lived in Israel. She left Ann Arbor right after she graduated from high school, and she's been there. She claimed that she wanted to go to Israel to find her Jewish identity because we were not very active in the Jewish community here. And she ended up marrying a Palestinian. And so my two granddaughters born in Israel are half Jewish and half Muslim. And I, I had met several other women who had children in Israel, and we would meet for coffee and talk about whatever we understood about the situation. And that led to founding this group. There had been another group in Ann Arbor of Jewish and Palestinian women. And so I'd met a few of these women, but the group did not survive very long. And I'd lost contact. So we first, a group of Jewish women, reestablished contact with the Palestinian women who had been in the previous group. And eventually we had 6 Palestinian and 6 Jewish women who were committed to a dialogue process that we engaged in, where we would meet every other week in our homes, have a meal, share food, rotate from one living room to another. We had shared responsibilities. Everybody was a host periodically, was a facilitator. They'd all rotated. We had a scribe every meeting, and the host usually chose a topic for a dialogue, and we used a particular process, which consists primarily of listening and speaking to the group rather to an individual. And there was no confrontation ever within the group. It's not that we all agree all the time. We work towards consensus, but you can't have unanimity on all these subjects. But well, I should say that the first year, or more than a year, we spent just listening to each other's stories, to create safety, to get to know each other, and to bond in a way. And only then did we start talking about the difficult subjects of conflict and Zionism and loss and division and many other topics of inequality and power and you name it. And so we were established in 2003. So we're coming close to being 20 years old. Of course, it doesn't consist of the same membership. Some people moved away. Some people couldn't continue the commitment of every other week. But the core of the group has persisted all these years. And of course, now we can't meet in our homes. So we meet every week now on Zoom. 1 week is just social, and the next week we address a topic for dialogue. And I think all of us have learned a lot from each other, have learned a lot from the process of dialogue, of listening and reconsidering and kind of putting away preconceptions. And we try to develop a new meaning in these dialogues where there are differences, that we come closer together. And we have certainly learned that our commonalities overwhelm the differences that we hold in background and perspective and so long. So it's a very strong relationship that has developed.
Wow, I just think that's something we can all really learn from and think about in this time.
There is a film about the group Zaytuna. It's called Refusing to Be Enemies. And that's our motto.
Okay, yeah, I will. And is that available on Amazon? Do you know, or I'll look into it.
Yeah,
I'll
it,
look
it
into it.
used to be available. I haven't checked it out recently, but it hasn't gone out of fashion.
Yeah, I can see it's a lifelong topic. Okay,
I
how
guess it's similar to this movie, that you could probably get it in the same way.
okay. Okay, all right. I will
Ruth,
check
would you mind showing everyone on the screen? It'd be just so much more interesting for me.
in- Wow. Yeah, I will do that now that we're doing the questions.
Okay.
Okay, so and there are lots of questions, but before we leave this sort of topic, there was a question about your grandchildren and what religion are they being raised? How are your grandchildren who are part Palestinian, Palestinian, Muslim, Jewish?
Right.
How does that work?
Well, mostly Jewish, because living in Israel, living in the Jewish part of Israel is a lot more, provides many more opportunities than if you identify as a Palestinian. But they're still, they're very close to their father and to the village that he comes from and to all their cousins and aunts and uncles. But my one granddaughter, she married a Jewish, an Israeli, and she's a lawyer. She has the two great grandchildren. And my other granddaughter, she is now in America. She lived for a number of years in California, has a nursing degree, and works at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. George Washington University Hospital. And she is now married to a Druze who is a boyfriend that she met in Israel, and he came here on a visitor's visa, which expired. So in order for him to be able to stay, which maybe now that we have a new administration has a better chance, but they were advised to get married. So.
Okay, thank you. All right, so here's a question from Dave Barris. So we just read last month the book, The Collaborator, and it's a fictional account, but with truth to it about the Kastner train of Hungarians. He negotiated with Eichmann. I'm not sure you're familiar, but that train of 1,600 Jews went to Bergen-Belsen.
Yes.
Before they were released, and so his question is, did you have contact with anyone on the Kastner train, any of the Hungarian Jews while at Bergen-Belsen?
No, but I know about it, and there's a book about our train from Bergen-Belsen to Switzerland. It's the German title, but it's sort of Hitler's trade of Jews, and that book describes the Kastner train. And I don't know the timing. I don't remember the timing of it, but we never met them in Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen had 8 or more camps, and they were all isolated from each other. So I didn't meet anybody, but I know the story of what happened with Kastner in Israel, which is sort of mind-boggling, that a man who worked so hard to save all these Jews, to get them liberated from Hungary, and then he gets assassinated. So
Yeah,
it's an
it was pretty
interesting.
crazy. Yeah, and we were really fortunate. We actually, through happenstance, had one of the people who was on the train with us.
Oh,
It's
wow.
really fascinating. Yeah. Um, so here's a question. When you were separated from your mother and brother and you had to go to Africa, how did you keep tabs and were you able to stay in touch with them, and how did that work?
Well, the first 3 months, I wasn't able to be in touch with them, only after the war ended in May. And then one day I received a telegram that said that they were recovering. And from there on, we were able to correspond. Of course, there was no email, there was no telephone connection. And so our letters went back and forth. And it was 18 months before we saw each other again. And we got a lot of help. Our camp was an UNRWA camp, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Association. And there was staff there in the camp that was very active in helping people to reach their destination, whether they went back to the country they came from or wherever. And it just took a long time. Immigration then wasn't that much easier than it is now. And it took a long time to get visas and transportation in the early post-war era.
I'm looking at some of the other questions here. So, I don't want to miss anybody. Okay, so have you had deniers at any of your talks, and have you had to, deal with that?
That's an interesting question. Actually, I did. I gave a talk some years ago at the Ann Arbor Public Library, and there was a Holocaust denier there, and he took over, and he said that even Elie Wiesel admitted that there were no gas chambers in Auschwitz. That's what he said, and the audience became very upset, and he tried to just hold the floor, and eventually the library was going to have someone kick him out, but he left on his own.
Did you have to address that directly,
Oh,
or
yes.
did you?
Oh, yes. I told him there wasn't an ounce of truth in that statement. He made it up, that I knew Elie Wiesel, and I know his story, and I know about his experiences, and he had no business making statements like that.
That must have been very upsetting.
Yeah, well, it is, and on the other hand, there isn't a shred of evidence, of all these statements that people make. And then there's so much evidence to the contrary. But of course, people who like to hear that, they will remember it.
Right. So Irene, can you tell us about going back to Amsterdam and going back to Berlin, and what happened with your father's remains, and how that's been honored now?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, my father is buried at a Jewish cemetery in a small town about 13 kilometers from where his remains were taken off the train. He was first buried in a Christian cemetery in Biberach, but then after the war ended, he was transferred to a Jewish cemetery in Laupheim, and I've been there half a dozen times to visit his graves. I've made friends with people in that town, and if God wills, maybe I'll be able to make one more visit to him. But what was the other part of your question?
Yeah, so going back to
Oh,
Berlin.
yes, right. Well, in 1991, we had a family reunion. My brother has 2 children and my 2 children, and the 4 children ganged up on us and asked us to take them on a trip to the sites of family history. And first, it was a big shock because we had never thought that we would go back. But then gradually we thought it was a good idea, and we did. We went to Berlin, we went to Amsterdam, Westerbork, Bergen-Belsen, and my father's grave site. And it was a remarkable trip. And we're very grateful to our children to have suggested it, to share the experience of being in those places together was very important. And later on, even my grandchildren got to go to see my father's, visit the cemetery where my father is buried. I think it made a big impression on them to see those sites. And
How did it feel to be back in Germany?
well, at that time, I didn't feel that comfortable, even though people were hosting us in a very genteel way. And like, for example, in Laupheim, the town where my father is buried, the people who were showing us around took us to a bakery where every Friday they bake challah, and the whole town buys challahs there, not knowing that it's a Jewish kind of bread baked Fridays for a particular purpose, for Friday night, for Shabbos celebration. But this baker came out, he even gave us a challah. He was very proud of the challahs things like that, which were very heartwarming. But since then, I been invited to talk in schools a couple of times in Germany, and it's made a big difference. The last time I was invited, they asked me if I could give my talk in German, and I said I didn't think so. I had distanced myself from the language for many, many years, but I'd already been there for a few days with these friends who were hosting me. And so when it came time to do my talk, I gave it in German. I mean, I wasn't even conscious of the fact that I was speaking German. So it seemed like I had come full circle.
Yeah, I remember that story. That was amazing. So Evelyn, can you talk to us a little bit about the process of making the film? We've had a question about that.
Sure, I kind of lost the whole thing. Can you let me back in?
You are in. We can
I'm
hear
in,
you,
okay.
and we can see you.
So I didn't know anything about making a film, of course. But I had this, but I always loved films. So actually what I started doing was I worked on public TV, not public TV, community television. It's not that well known. In fact, it does not exist anymore. I've lost track of it. But it used to be that there was staff there and they encouraged people to come make TV programs. And, you'd skip right by them on the channels because they were usually pretty terrible. But I got some experience that way, making TV programs, shooting lectures that were being held anyway. They used to, I don't know if they still do that, but they recorded the city council meetings, things like that. And so I got a little bit of experience in that way. And then I got to work a little bit with Lori, who had also done some film work. She, Lori White, who made Refusing to Be Enemies that Irene mentioned. I worked with her a little bit because she was making a film. And then I actually hired, oh, and then, I mean, the important thing is that this was after I retired. So I started taking classes at Washtenaw Community College, which, you know, is really an awesome resource in our community. They have some wonderful classes there. And so I took a film class, and that was basically where I learned to do films. And then I also got to take a documentary film class. That was very important to me. There was the teacher was a documentarian. She made documentary film classes, and she happened to be the partner of the guy who was teaching the first class. And she was very, very helpful to me. She advised me on many things. And so I actually never really made anything in her class, but I learned a lot about documentary filmmaking. And she also connected me with a wonderful editor. Now, I'm really of the opinion that an editor makes a movie. I mean, more so in some ways than the director. It's the editor that really defines the movie, that creates the quality in the movie. And his name is Eli. He's Israeli. He actually, his mother knew Irene, and he lives in suburban Detroit. And he was making his living as an editor, which I understand now he's been unable to do that. It's not like it had been. But he was a fabulous editor. And he took all the stuff I had. And I mean, you know, it was there. I had a lot of footage because I had gone with Irene to a number of schools. And so I had a lot of footage. I also did individual interviews with Irene and the guy in Rackham who was the faculty person. Irene would know his name.
Oh, you mean the dean, John Godfrey?
The dean, yeah, who was very supportive. I was able to, it just so happened that the first weekend that I worked on the film, Irene's granddaughters were at Irene's house, and her son was there with his son, who was a toddler, who's now 18, 20, something like that. So I met Irene's granddaughters, and I met her son, and I interviewed her son individually while he was there. And one of the things I think the film proves is that Irene's family should never sing any kind of music, because the little shot I have of them, lighting the candles is really quite pitiful, and singing with the candles. So, so I had an interview, I had a wonderful interview with Irene's son. And then Ella, who never did, while I was making the film, she never did come to Ann Arbor, but she did come to, I'm not, I don't remember anymore why. She was in Seattle, I think, or Portland, somewhere in the Northwest. She had a reason to be there. So I discovered that it was possible to hire a filmmaker in whichever city it was that she was at. And I no longer remember if it was online. Oh, I joined some online group, and that's how I got that done. And so I hired a filmmaker, a local filmmaker, and he interviewed Ella. Unfortunately, he lost part of it, but I got part of it. And let's see what else. I had an editor at first who was from Ann Arbor, and he wasn't anyway near as skilled as Ellie. But he did know a woman who is an animator. And I would never have thought of putting in the animated map of Irene's, we can hardly call them travels.
Right. No, yeah, I know what you're talking about, all the journey pieces.
Right. But I think that helps a lot, because you can see where, where she was going. And she did a nice job. So, and then actually I have a terrible memory. And a lot of the beginning of the film, I was using music, that was known to me, and I can't remember anymore where it came from. But the second half of the film, I didn't have any music for. And I have an ex-husband who is a musician, who was not particularly employed at the time. And he composed the music for the second half of the film, which is it's not particularly memorable, but it's not obtrusive or anything. And he actually put together a little combo of instruments, and he had to record it. And, and that was pretty painstaking, because he had to have the minutes of the film, so that the music matched the film. And he put together the recording of the film. And
Evelyn, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are just over an hour at this point, and I know people have other things to do. No, I mean, it was super interesting, and I'm coming back to like the word you used at the beginning, that word resilience. I mean, it sounds like, I'm sure no piece of art is easy to put together, film, book, whatever, and it takes a village, and you had a
it did, yeah, that's
village. And that's wonderful. Because the end product was absolutely wonderful. And
well, I'm proud of it. And of course, Irene has a lot to, Irene's personality has a lot to do with that.
Of course. And so I just want to thank you for being here today. And Irene,
this is so fun.
Hugs to you. I'm so glad you could be with us today. And if people have follow-up questions, like I know, Howard Kerner is on here, and he's he's like a scholar around Anne Frank, so if any of you have more questions for Irene or Evelyn, please let me know. We'll look into some of the, the films that that were mentioned in books and get you some information to follow up on that. And
I'd like to answer questions.
yeah,
I'll be glad to answer any questions.
fantastic. I knew you would. So yeah, so thank you everybody for being here today. It was it was such a joy for me to be able to introduce you to these.
Thank you for arranging it. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yes.
I am going to bring this Michigan Florida group together. It's gonna happen. But have a
was a
wonderful weekend,
pleasure.
everyone. And thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
You too.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, where'd it go? God.